Let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with it for a moment. Not answer quickly, not defend yourself, just feel it. Have you ever noticed that the moment you stop trying so hard, something shifts? Not because you're playing games, not because you're being cold or distant, but because quietly you stop chasing validation. And suddenly she notices. If you're listening to this, chances are you're a man who has felt invisible at some point. You've done the right things, you've shown interest, you've been consistent, you've been kind, and still, you've had moments where it felt like your effort was pouring into a cup with a crack at the bottom. That feeling, the confusion, the quiet self-doubt, it doesn't come from weakness, it comes from caring. And I want to be very clear with you, this conversation isn't about manipulation. It's not about winning women. It's about understanding emotional dynamics, especially the moment a woman senses that a man's attention is no longer centered on her. Because here's the truth, most men never hear explained calmly, honestly, and without shame. When you lose interest, genuinely, it activates something very specific in a woman's emotional awareness. Not panic, not obsession, awareness. You see, attraction doesn't disappear because a man becomes quiet. It disappears when a man becomes needy. And there is a massive difference between those two states, one that men often don't realize they're broadcasting. From a woman's perspective, interest isn't measured by how much you give. It's measured by how grounded you remain while giving. When that grounding disappears, when your life, your mood, your sense of self starts orbiting her reactions, something subtly breaks the emotional polarity. And when that happens, women don't always pull away consciously. Often they just feel different around you. So what happens when the opposite occurs? When you stop over-explaining, when you stop proving, when you stop chasing clarity that hasn't been earned? She feels it, not as rejection, but as a shift in emotional balance. This video isn't here to tell you to disappear or punish silence with silence. It's here to help you understand what a woman experiences internally when she realizes your attention is no longer something she can predict or lean on emotionally. Because that moment, the exact moment she senses you're no longer centered on her response, is where her behavior changes. Sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, but always meaningfully. And once you understand why that reaction happens, you stop guessing. You stop spiraling. You stop asking, did I do something wrong? Instead, you start leading your emotional presence, calmly, confidently, without force. So if you've ever wondered why pulling back naturally feels different from pulling back strategically, why some men regain attraction without saying a word, and why emotional self-containment is far more powerful than emotional withdrawal, stay with me, because this isn't about controlling her. It's about finally understanding yourself in the dynamic. The moment she feels the shift and why it catches her off guard. Let me ask you a question that might feel uncomfortable at first, but stay with me. Have you ever noticed that when you finally stop trying to fix the connection, she suddenly becomes more aware of you? Not warmer, not colder, just more alert. Here's why that moment matters so much. Imagine this scenario. You've been consistent. You've initiated conversations. You've checked in. You've made emotional space. And one day, not out of strategy, but out of self-respect, you stop leaning forward so much. You don't disappear. You don't punish. You simply return your attention to your own life. From your side, it feels quiet, maybe even a little empty at first. From her side, something shifts. Psychologically, women are highly attuned to emotional patterns, especially consistency. When your presence is steady, predictable, and emotionally available, it becomes part of her internal environment. Not in a bad way, but in a familiar one. So when that emotional rhythm changes, her nervous system notices before her logic does. She may not think he lost interest. Instead, she feels something is different. That difference creates awareness. Here's the insight most men miss. Awareness is not rejection, it's curiosity. When your attention is no longer something she can emotionally lean on without effort, her mind starts asking questions. Not because she's afraid of losing you, but because humans are wired to notice change in emotional availability. And this is where men often misunderstand what's happening. They assume her sudden checking in, subtle questions, or change in tone means she's testing control. In reality, she's recalibrating emotional safety. She's asking herself, where do I stand now? How connected are we really? What changed in him? And here's the important part. Your response in this phase matters more than your withdrawal ever did. The solution is not to explain yourself, not to justify your distance, not to rush back into reassurance. The healthiest mindset shift is this: you don't owe emotional access when you're realigning with yourself. When you remain calm, present, and emotionally steady, without overcorrecting, you signal something powerful: self-containment. That's not indifference. That's emotional leadership. And emotional leadership feels grounding to a woman, even if it initially unsettles her expectations. So the question becomes, when she feels the shift and starts watching more closely, will you stay grounded in who you are? Or will you rush to restore a version of yourself that was never sustainable? Because what happens next depends entirely on that answer. And that brings us to section 2, where we'll talk about why emotional availability becomes more valuable the moment it's no longer guaranteed. Why emotional availability feels different when it's not guaranteed. Let me ask you something subtle, and I want you to be honest with yourself here. Have you ever noticed how something feels more meaningful the moment it's no longer automatic? Not because it was taken away cruelly, but because it stopped being assumed. This is exactly what happens when a woman realizes your emotional availability is no longer guaranteed. Here's a simple scenario many men recognize. You've been the one who always replies quickly. You're the one who listens deeply. You're emotionally present, steady, reliable. And then something changes. Not because you're angry, but because you've started prioritizing your own inner balance. Your responses are still kind, still respectful, just not immediately accessible on demand. From your perspective, you're finally breathing. From her perspective, the emotional ground has shifted. And here's the psychological insight most men never hear explained clearly. Emotional availability only feels invisible when it's constant. When a woman knows, unconsciously, that your presence will always be there no matter what, it blends into emotional background noise. That doesn't mean she doesn't value you. It means the nervous system stops registering the availability as something to notice. But when that availability becomes conditional on your own emotional well-being, it suddenly carries weight. Not pressure, not fear, weight. This is where men often misunderstand what's happening and accidentally sabotage themselves. They think, if I don't give more, I'll lose her. But psychologically, the opposite is happening. When emotional availability isn't guaranteed, a woman starts engaging more consciously. She listens differently. She feels the interaction instead of leaning on it. She becomes present rather than passive. This isn't about scarcity. It's about presence being chosen, not assumed. And that distinction matters deeply in emotional dynamics. Now, let me gently challenge something here. Many men confuse emotional availability with emotional overextension. Being available doesn't mean being endlessly accessible. It doesn't mean abandoning your own emotional rhythm to maintain connection. Healthy emotional availability says, I'm here, and I'm also whole on my own. When a woman feels that balance, it creates emotional polarity. She senses that your attention is a gift, not a default setting. And here's the part that often surprises men. When your emotional availability becomes intentional instead of automatic, women often feel safer, not more anxious. Why? Because predictability rooted in self-respect feels stable. Predictability rooted in need feels heavy. When you stay grounded, calm, responsive, but not over-explaining, you communicate emotional maturity without saying a word. So what's the mindset shift here? Stop asking yourself, how do I keep her interested? Start asking, is my presence coming from fullness or fear? Because women feel that difference instantly. And when your availability comes from fullness, it invites her to meet you there, emotionally, not performatively. But here's where the story deepens. Sometimes when men pull back emotionally, they do it with the right intention, but the wrong execution. And that's where things can quietly fall apart without anyone meaning them to. So the next question becomes, what happens when a man pulls back, but does it unconsciously, reactively, or with resentment instead of clarity? That's what we need to talk about next. Because in section 3, I'm going to offer you a calm but honest wake-up call, not to criticize you, but to help you avoid the most common mistake men make at this stage without even realizing it. The mistake men make when they pull back. A calm wake-up call. Let me say this gently because it matters, and because most men have never had this explained to them without blame. Pulling back is not the problem. Pulling back without emotional clarity is. This is where many men lose their grounding, not because they lack value, but because they confuse self-respect with emotional shutdown. Here's a familiar pattern. A man realizes he's been overgiving. He feels unappreciated, overlooked, or emotionally drained, so he decides to step back. On the surface, that sounds healthy, but internally, he's still watching, still waiting, still hoping the shift will force a response. And this is the quiet mistake. When pulling back comes from frustration instead of self-alignment, it carries a different emotional signal. One women can feel instantly. Let me explain why. Women don't respond to distance itself. They respond to the emotional state behind the distance. If your pullback is calm, grounded, and rooted in your own life expanding, it feels stable, even attractive. But if it's loaded with resentment, silent expectations, or unspoken tests, it creates emotional tension instead of polarity. And this is the part most men don't want to hear, but need to. Sometimes, pulling back isn't strength. Sometimes, it's avoidance disguised as self-control. That doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. But here's the wake-up call. Emotional leadership requires presence, not withdrawal. A grounded man doesn't disappear to be missed. He stays steady whether he's noticed or not. From a woman's perspective, there's a huge difference between a man who is less available because his life is full, a man who is less available because he's emotionally withdrawing. One feels centered, the other feels tense, and tension is not the same thing as attraction. This is where I want to offer you a powerful mindset shift. Instead of asking, "Did she notice I pulled back?" Ask, "Am I still emotionally regulated without her response?" That question changes everything. Because the goal isn't to make her react. The goal is to remain yourself, even when no reaction comes. When men pull back correctly, they don't monitor outcomes. They don't wait for texts as proof. They don't replay conversations for signs of regret. They redirect energy inward, into purpose, presence, and emotional balance. And here's the surprising part. When a woman senses that your emotional center is no longer dependent on her behavior, she relaxes, even if she doesn't fully understand why, because stability is attractive, not strategy, not silence. Stability. So let me be very clear and kind here. If pulling back makes you anxious, bitter, or hyper-focused on her response, then you haven't really pulled back. You've just paused your expression. True emotional maturity feels quiet inside, not tense, not performative. And this matters deeply because how you pull back determines what happens next. If you stay grounded, she may step forward emotionally. If you withdraw with expectation, she may sense pressure she can't name and pull away further. So the real question becomes, can you stay present, open, and emotionally steady even when you're no longer leading with pursuit? Because what women respond to next isn't distance. It's how safe your presence feels when the dynamic shifts. And that leads us into section 4, where we'll talk about something many men misunderstand completely. Why, when you step back, women don't test your interest. They test emotional safety. And that changes how you interpret everything that follows. How women test safety, not interest, when you step away. Let me start with something that might completely change how you interpret her behavior. When you step back in a grounded, healthy way, a woman is rarely asking, "Does he still like me?" She's asking, "Is it safe to move toward him?" That difference matters more than you think. Many men assume that when a woman starts acting differently after they pull back, asking subtle questions, reappearing casually, changing her tone, she's testing attraction. But psychologically, what she's really testing is emotional safety. Let me give you a simple real-life scenario. You stop initiating as much. You stay kind, present, but less emotionally predictable. A few days pass, then she sends something light, maybe playful, maybe neutral, maybe a simple check-in that doesn't demand much. From the outside, it looks casual. Internally, she's observing, not to control you, but to understand the new emotional landscape. She's asking herself, if I step forward, will he be steady or reactive? Is his distance peaceful or loaded? Does he feel grounded or guarded? And here's the insight most men miss. Women move toward emotional safety before they move toward attraction. If your pullback feels calm and centered, her nervous system relaxes. That relaxation creates space for curiosity, warmth, and reconnection. But if your pullback feels sharp, closed, or emotionally cold, even subtly, it signals unpredictability. And unpredictability doesn't invite closeness. This is why some men are confused when they pull back and she doesn't chase, but also doesn't fully let go. She's waiting, not to see if you'll pursue, but to see who you are now, and your response in this phase communicates everything. Here's the grounded approach. You don't interrogate her message. You don't overinvest emotionally to prove safety. You respond with warmth, clarity, and emotional steadiness. Not more, not less, just clean. That cleanliness matters because safety for women isn't built through intensity. It's built through consistency without pressure. And here's something I want you to hear clearly. If a woman senses that reconnecting with you means emotional turbulence, she'll hesitate, even if attraction is still there. That hesitation isn't rejection, it's self-protection. So the solution isn't to lean forward harder, it's to remain emotionally regulated regardless of outcome. Ask yourself this: can I be warm without being attached? Can I be present without seeking reassurance? Those questions are the real test. And when you pass them, quietly, naturally, something interesting happens. She begins to engage more freely, not because she feels pulled, but because she feels safe. Now, let's take this out of theory and into everyday life, because understanding emotional safety isn't just about texts or pullback moments. It shows up in ordinary situations, conversations, pauses, shared silence, missed expectations. And in the final section, we're going to ground all of this in real, relatable life dynamics, the kind that make men suddenly realize, oh, this isn't about her reacting to me. This is about who I am when nothing is being asked of me. That's what we'll explore in Section 5. What happens when you stay grounded instead of reactive? Let me bring this into real life. Not theory, not psychology terms, just the moments men quietly experience, but rarely talk about. Imagine this. You don't text her one evening because you're genuinely busy, not avoiding, not testing, just living your life. The next day, the conversation resumes naturally. No tension, no explanation, no apology. Something feels different. That difference is grounding. When you stay grounded instead of reactive, the dynamic shifts in ways that are subtle but powerful. And this is where many men finally stop feeling confused. Because here's what grounding actually looks like in everyday life. You don't rush to fill silence. You don't read meaning into every delay. You don't emotionally spike based on her mood. You don't overcorrect to regain closeness. You remain emotionally available, but not emotionally dependent. From a woman's perspective, this feels steady, predictable in a good way, not flat, not distant, just solid. And solidity is rare. Think about how many men swing between extremes: intense attention one week, emotional withdrawal the next. That inconsistency creates emotional noise. Grounding removes that noise. Here's a relatable example. She mentions something casually, a stressful day, a passing frustration. The reactive response is to fix it, soothe it, or prove support immediately. The grounded response is presence. You listen, you acknowledge, you don't make it about earning approval. That restraint isn't coldness, it's emotional confidence, and women feel that difference deeply. Another real-life moment men recognize: plans change, timing shifts, life happens. A reactive man reads rejection into inconvenience. A grounded man adjusts without internal collapse. That calm adaptability communicates something powerful. My emotional state isn't fragile. And fragility, not vulnerability, but fragility, is what quietly erodes attraction. Here's the key psychological insight of this entire video. When a man stays grounded, a woman doesn't feel managed. She feels met. There's no pressure to perform, no emotional tug-of-war, just two adults interacting from a place of self-respect. And here's what often surprises men most. When you stop reacting, she often starts revealing more. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. She shares more honestly. She relaxes into conversation. She stops scanning for emotional tension, because grounding creates emotional permission. Now, this doesn't guarantee outcomes, and that's important to say calmly and clearly. Grounding doesn't force attraction. It reveals truth. Sometimes the truth is deeper connection. Sometimes it's clarity that the dynamic has run its course. And both outcomes are healthy. The power isn't in keeping her, it's in keeping yourself. When you remain centered regardless of how she responds, you stop negotiating your worth through attention. And that's when relationships, romantic or otherwise, become lighter, clearer, and more honest. So here's the final question I want to leave hanging before the conclusion. If your calm presence remains the same, whether she leans in or steps back? Who are you really becoming in the process? Because that answer matters far more than any reaction she could give, and that's where everything we've talked about finally comes together. Let me leave you with a thought that may feel uncomfortable at first, but sit with it. The moment you stop trying to be chosen, you finally become visible. Not because women enjoy distance, not because attention is a game, but because grounded men don't negotiate their worth through reaction. And as a woman speaking directly to you, I want you to hear this without judgment. Most men aren't struggling because they care too much. They're struggling because they were never taught how to care without abandoning themselves. When you stay emotionally steady, not withdrawn, not performative, you stop creating pressure. And pressure is what quietly suffocates attraction long before anyone admits it's gone. If there's one thing I hope you take from this video, it's this. Your calm presence is more powerful than your pursuit. Not because it controls her, but because it stabilizes you. And from that place, whether she leans in or steps away, you remain intact. That's real confidence, that's emotional leadership, and that's what mature connection responds to. I'd really like to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever noticed a shift when you stopped reacting and started grounding yourself? What changed, in her or in you? Share your experience. I read them and I respond because this conversation matters. I'll leave you with this final reflection. Attraction grows where self-respect is calm, not loud. Carry that with you. That.